Oh, hey, Jason.
Hi, Gretchen.
How's it going?
Good. I'm gonna get some more coffee while we wait. Be right back.
And do we expect Kevin today? No, he sometimes. Okay. Well, why don't we go ahead and get started then, since we don't know that we are expecting him. Gretchen, do you think you could take notes on this one? That'd be excellent. Okay. Well, Gretchen, let's just go ahead and start with your updates.
So thank you, Rob, for fixing whatever was causing those failed to fetch and internal server errors. They seem to be fixed today, so that's great. I did want to check in. Justin Shell noticed this weird behavior in his scanner output last week between lines 108 and 117 that looks like it kind of like stopped midway on line 108. And so I just wanted, I had spot checked a couple and like didn't notice this behavior on like just, two that I tend to spot check before uploading. But I definitely have not gone through and like looked at all of them to see if any others have the same kind of thing.
That was that was last week, right?
Yeah.
And which sheet from which email does that correspond to?
This is the one from all versions.
Okay. Okay. Between which lines?
108 and 117.
I'll try and pull that up, but in the meantime, the thing to remember is from 2 weeks ago is when Internet Archive was still having problems. So there might be all kinds of funky stuff if you're pulling things out of not the versionista only sheet.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I don't know why I thought they had like resolved those by the time this one was scraped.
They might have, and then they recurred.
Okay.
It happened twice within the span of a week and a half.
Okay.
So it broke, and then it was broken for most of a week, and then it was fixed, and then it broke again a day later, and then it was broken for 3 days. So.
Okay. Okay. All that looks like happened here is just that like it stopped on line 108, and then like it looks like what should have finished line 108 like became the beginning of line 117. Like the columns would match up if you shifted them up and over. Yeah, I just wanted to like, I just wasn't sure if there's any sort of like transcription error.
The way we assemble those CSVs shouldn't be able to get results like that.
Yeah.
I have to take a look and try and understand what's going on.
Okay. Yeah, I don't really know either, but in case it was a systematic thing, I just wanted to bring it up. If it's one weird fluke, oh well. And that's it from me.
Okay. Well, I got the incident report done for blowing up all of our SSL certs. So I know thoroughly that, specifying the wrong certs and then deploying it is not the thing to do. Reviewed Rob's Sentry tracking for the diff server this morning. Played with it in my little local Minikube environment, and it works. It pushes things to Sentry. Yes, Rob?
This goes for me too, but just as a reminder for all of us, if we're going to test Sentry things, we should either make sure that we have environments set up for Sentry, or we should just have our own Sentry, crappy free Sentry account that we do the testing on. Because I did this to everybody last night also, and so it's much my fault. And then I thought I had cleanly deleted them all, and I was like, it would be no big deal. And then there were ones that I missed. And so it's just, that was bad. Because I rolled out of bed this morning on my way to get dressed to get on my bike, and there's this email from Dan that's like, wait, is this a real error? And I'm like, no.
Well, happily, I didn't see any of it until it was all there together, the Sentry reports and the pull request for Sentry. So it was like, oh, well, this makes sense. And then I went ahead and generated some more Sentry traffic right behind you. You're welcome, everybody.
Meanwhile, I'm in a phone booth changing into Superman, ready to go into.
Dan's like, oh shit, everything's blown up. I gotta fix it.
So yeah, we could probably have a little bit better process there. I like that idea, just doing individual free Sentry accounts. That's an easy, we don't have to do anything to make that happy. So those are the things I did. I have marked as in progress, my working on things in my Minikube. I think this is actually all working so far as Minikube is concerned. But now I'm actually, finally, for the first time since I started, trying to understand the way that all of the pieces fit together in a, fresh environment that doesn't already have all of this existing stuff in place and happening and happy data already there. So at least as of this morning, I'm actually able to, I've been testing the Internet Archive importer locally and watching the spice flow to an AWS S3 bucket that I've set up for this to talk to. And pieces of it are broken, but I don't necessarily know that that's because my development environment's broken. I think it's probably because my understanding of what all I have to do to make it work is broken. So this is a good thing for me to be going through. I may have questions though if I can't seem to figure out how to, I definitely have changes getting pushed to S3 buckets where I expect them to, but whenever I go to actually look at comparisons of changes, things kind of blow up in my local environment. So, but I need to validate that I've got everything set up right. Yes.
You might want to make sure that if they are going to S3 buckets instead of to your local file system, that those S3 buckets are public, because the differs independent doesn't have any of the credentials to pull stuff out of a private S3 bucket.
Yes, whenever I set those up, so I'm just reusing the testing buckets that I set up for Ansible, and I basically copied the policies. So a couple of them are internal, but the ones that actually have the captures are public. But yeah, I'll go through there and check, and it might be worth me. I'm not getting any AWS access denied errors at this point on anything that I'm following logs on. So we'll see.
Okay. Sorry.
I was just going to say I may end up with some more informed questions as I spend a little bit more time with it.
Yeah, there's another related thing, which is I think in most cases, because we have file support in the differ now, this might actually work in a debug environment. But traditionally, if you have the DB saving to the file system instead of S3, diffs won't work. because, and this is a long-standing thing that we've been meaning to change that Dan and I have talked about, but I'm not sure there's actually an issue for it, which is that the DB stores a URL that it can always reach to wherever the content of the version lives. But that may or may not be a URL that a client of the DB can reach. And the DB just gives you back that URL as the URL to use instead of a proxy URL within DB. Like it should be, you know, API v0 versions, version ID, content, or raw or something. And that should proxy out the content of the version from wherever it is that it lives. Or give you a redirect so that we don't have the overhead of like moving the data through Rails, which is stupid if it's on a like public S3 bucket instead of a file system. That way we have like much more flexibility with what's happening. We never have to worry about wherever the file lives. Is it accessible by the differ? Is it accessible by a client? Is it mobile? But like we haven't ever bothered to do that because in practice, everything is always public in reality. But it's a thing that we should have done long ago. And it's not even a hard change. It's just somebody's gotten around to it. But, yeah, just FYI, if that might be part of your problem or if you hadn't run into that.
As I've been playing with this, I've been learning more about some of the like non-load balancer ways to do to expose networking in Kubernetes. And so the other thing is there could probably be some fairly easy just service definition workarounds for local dev to just make those URLs work because you just want everything to work in dev, unless you're testing access control, of course. So that could be good. Oh, I also noticed this. I did this for myself for troubleshooting and making config easier. But we can also be adding in a little bit more environmental information about the pod and the node as environment variables that are accessible to the running pod. And actually thinking about this Sentry, we're just talking about how we could be doing Sentry better. That seems like good data to be injecting into Sentry. So for instance, like namespace and pod IP address or node IP address, that kind of stuff looks like it's accessible. So that's in my little Minikube thing, and I might work up a little PR for just adding that data in.
That would be beautiful. The other thing that's I think is sort of thematically related is I think there's an issue on every repo to say integrate Sentry releases. So if we include some kind of release ID or the git SHA hash or something in the environment, then Sentry can pick up on that. And it can also know then, like when we've made a release, that it should try and figure out, oh, does it look like this issue has been fixed? Or it can show the releases on its charts over time of bugs, so you can see the actual impact of things.
That seems like it should be possible to just set that, you know, whether it's the container hash from the container, since that's going to be the same, or from somewhere else. Seems like we ought to be able to get shoehorn that into an environment variable.
Yeah, my thought on those before we had like Kubernetes working well or anything else was that we would just build that environment variable into the container as part of the container, as part of the Docker file. But I didn't know. I haven't dived into enough, and I don't know all the like really crazy things you can do in a Docker file or not. If there's a way to sort of like dynamically define that, or if we would then have to have like a better build script that fills in the Docker file with information before it builds the Docker file.
Yeah, and I think the dumbest way we can do it is probably the best way.
Yeah. Anyway.
That's all I have. So, Rob?
Oh, yeah, I guess that's me next. So I noted a few things from last week because I wasn't here last week, and I also didn't fill in the sheet last week because I'm an ass. And then also, before anything else, I want to apologize for my super salty after you merged, when I had plenty of time to comment before you merged, move from Dan's repo to the public repo about services. I think I had good points, but I could have made them in a much better, less asinine way, and I'm sorry for that. That was kind of uncalled for. Anyway, so just wanted to apologize for that.
We're all cool.
And so for this past week, I feel like I haven't gotten any of the things I need to get done. All the things that have been sitting for 2 weeks are still sitting because I haven't had any time over the past 2 weeks to do anything but just do emergencies. But so patched a bunch of security vulnerabilities that came up. I killed off all the Heroku stuff. And then, so all the rest of the things have to do with the issues with the differ. So the original problem is just the escalating load the auto analysis pipeline was putting on the differs caused the differs to start to fail a lot more because they weren't handling that load very well. So we started to look into handling that load, and one of the really obvious things I saw is that we use a process pool for doing the actual diff routines because they are long-lived, CPU intensive, and possibly prone to catastrophic failure, which means you at least want them on a thread, if not a separate process, and really you want them on a separate process because since they're CPU bound, they'll also be GIL bound in Python. It's a specific Python concern. You wouldn't care to put them in a different process in most other languages, but super important in Python. But we happen to be creating a whole new pool on every request that differ, which led to a lot of process overhead, but it also led to a lot of failed diffs because the process pool would break every so often, I presume, at least partially because, hey, you've made 40 gajillion process pools over the last 3 days of the service being up and never shut down any of them. So the system would just shut them down randomly. And so we'd get broken process pool exceptions all over the place. That was like a thing that I noticed partially just looking at the code, and partially I went to look at the logs and was like, oh, we have a lot of broken process pool exceptions. Like almost all our exceptions are broken process pool exceptions. And so I fixed that by making sure that we only had one process pool that we used for all diffs, which is much more sane. But then that exacerbated the fact that if the process pool did break, then everything went down. So the fun effect of having the first hour of diffing after I deployed that change work fine and have a very nice speed improvement. And so everything looked great. And then it got even faster. And I thought maybe I was just like averaging it out poorly or something else. And I didn't take the time to look closer into like, why did it seem like it sped up? And it turns out half a day later that it sped up because that is the point at which the process pool broke. And because we only had one process pool at that point, instead of creating new ones, that process pool is forever broken. So all diffs became instantaneous because as soon as you started them, they would fail because the process pool couldn't do anything. And so you'd start a diff and it would immediately come back with a, sorry, this diff failed because your whole process pool is broken. Which then led to the hotfix the other day of, oh, when we do a diff, we need to have code that handles possible broken process pool, tears down the existing process pool, sets up a new process pool, and then retries the diff in that process pool. So that's what it does now. So that is the saga of all the things that happened with the failed diffing, why it was bad, why it got worse all of a sudden, and now why it's fixed. So that was the last couple days dealing with all of that. And then as a result, also realizing that traipsing through the logs to find all those exceptions is painful, and we should have set up Sentry for it long ago and never did, so also doing that. That's the other thing I did last night. And then everything else is same as it's been, in progress and up next. I did add one other thing to up next. which is partially as a result of this. Need to take some time to look more deeply into both doing the right thing for diffing, which is queuing those diffs instead of doing them on a request response cycle, which we've talked about briefly before, but probably need to look more seriously into. And also, while doing that, finding a way to isolate the differs or some kind of diffing capacity or priority or something that we use for ad hoc diffs, which is basically when you're viewing it in the app and you want to see a diff, versus auto-analysis diffs, anything that's happening on like a giant pipeline that's just going to be going continuously forever. Because like that is also part of the problem that led to the original seeing lots of errors, is that the resource usage from the auto analysis pipeline was taking a lot of resources from the ad hoc work, and what used to mostly work 95% of the time just fine, then worked less often because everything was under much heavier load. That's less of a problem now that we fixed like the core problem that was adding unnecessary load, but it's still a thing. It just shouldn't happen as much. But it's a thing that we shouldn't have to worry about. And also, if we move to a queue-based infrastructure instead of a request-response-based infrastructure for doing the diffs, then we will necessarily wind up in a place where if the auto-analysis pipeline has like 20,000 diffs queued up, then your diff that you need to see right now is going to wait in line behind those 40,000 ones, which is not going to be a good time. You'll get your diff tomorrow instead of in a couple seconds.
So we could have it pull off of 2 queues, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
Like there's a boatload of
ways
ways to do it, right? Like we could have 2 sets of differs, one of which is smaller that's dedicated to ad hoc stuff, and one of which is bigger that's dedicated to the pipeline. We could have 2 queues. We could have some kind of priority feature for the messages on the queues. Lots of options there. So it's more just like you need to spend some time sitting down and thinking through those. And absolutely have to think through it if we move to the queue-based infrastructure, because that queue-based infrastructure will make the problem worse. Which in this aspect of moving to queues, I hadn't spent any time thinking about before. So partially maybe it's just a like reminder for me, but a reminder for all of us that like, oh, if we do the work for the more efficient thing, that makes another problem a bigger problem.
So you're thinking we would still have it through a normal, like from the client side, it would look like a normal HTTP request response. And we would just try to have our queues move fast enough that we don't need to give it like a token and a URL to check back on. Yeah,
I mean, I think if we're doing everything right, the best way, so there should be like 2 avenues into getting a diff, right? The one that like things that operate on pipelines would use is like throw something on the queue and like it'll be done later.
More like an import API.
Yeah. But if you're doing something where you need a diff in a very ad hoc way, you really want to be able to like ask for the diff and get it back. And so there should be a front end that turns that request response into a message on the queue and a wait for a message on a response queue or something along those lines. And then if we're doing that right, what it should do is basically it'll hang on for some amount of time, 30 seconds, I don't know, like totally adjustable. And if the response hasn't come back by then, it'll hand the client back some kind of job ID with a 202 response, which is, we accepted your request, it's still working. And then the client can come back with that job ID later and ask for it, and we'll either give back a 202, I'm still waiting, or like 400 something broke, or 200, like here's the result that finally happened. So you start with like a long pull and then if it hasn't finished by then the client basically starts pulling. Because we probably don't want to hold on to like infinity connections for infinity time.
Right.
Yeah. So, and that's where I'm, I've never dealt with like a queuing system in anything other than sort of a FIFO. But do we know, like, are there like convenient sort of like quality of service things that are baked into a queue system we might use? Like that might be a sort of like thing that we put on our list of wants for if we can get that out of the box or easy to implement for us.
Yeah, I think, so I feel like the way to go with this is in production, we should use SQS. But in development, probably we should do something based off Redis because you already have to have Redis running for some features. And so that's just like least extra stuff you have to set up. And it's a thing that you can run locally instead of needing to have your computer online just to run the dev server. That said, like the other alternative is to use some like dedicated queuing system that's not SQS to do the queues, and then we could set that up in your dev environment and in production. It's just more work to figure out how to manage it well in production, especially since we're on Kubernetes. We have to then actually solve the real problem that we have avoided solving, which is how do we have some long-lived resources in Kubernetes? How do we have disk space that they can pick back up from or whatever?
I don't know if
how do we keep long-lived EBS mounts, basically?
When I talked to Brendan, one of the things he mentioned that wasn't relevant to our immediate like Ansible versus Kubernetes discussion, I think, but something he was really excited about was that stateful sets are coming out of beta. The idea of a deployment or a replica set that has state wasn't really anywhere near what you want to use when we started this about a year ago, but now it's apparently getting good. So we should read about that if we go down that road.
For my part, I think the SQS approach would be better because even though like we'll have to probably write more code around it as opposed to using like RabbitMQ or ZeroMQ or like whatever the Apache.
Well, ZeroMQ is pretty low level too. That's not going to give you much.
Yeah, that's the other thing. Like I feel like ZeroMQ is probably not the greatest solution because we'd have to do a lot around it versus RabbitMQ, which like is pretty featureful and very reliable.
Yeah.
There's also now Amazon has a their version of whatever the Apache one is, which I think is like active message or active, I forget. But so you can either use their like per message priced ultra high level SQS, or you can use their message bus as a service. Which is sort of like the difference between using like S3 and the Elasticache Redis, right? So like either you're like, they're just managing a deployed service that is a standard sort of service you'd use, or like you have the ultra high level thing where you're just like, I want to put some data, I want to read some data. And it handles like all the everything about where that lives and how it's distributed and how it's more robust. I would probably go with the higher one, SQS, just because it's dumber. But you definitely have fewer features with it. Like it has a dead letter queue, but it's not super granular. You can only define like a time period for a queue in which you expect a message to be resolved. And if it hasn't been, or to be acknowledged, and if it hasn't basically been acted by then it comes back, but it comes back. You don't get to determine where in the queue it comes back, and like you can define a lot more granular and fancy rules with the like more complicated service. But I don't know if we actually need that. Anyway,
I think going with a "you aren't going to need it" approach for now, and then growing later is probably okay.
Yeah.
All right. Am I up?
Dan?
Yep. So been pretty busy with day job stuff. We're kind of skeleton crew right now. So I don't know how fast it's going to get better, but I at least try to review a bunch of stuff in the last day or so and keep on top of any urgent review requests related to Python that Rob tossed into the Slack channel. So hopefully that helps. I copied over my up next from last week, which I had copied over from the previous week, but hoping to get that stuff at some point. And then I mentioned also that at my day job, we're taking on more and more of the like ops stuff, just because if you need it done right, you got to do it yourself, I suppose. So we're learning about different monitoring dashboards, and I'm looking at things like Beats and Prometheus, and this is all adjacent to Grafana. Has anyone used Graylog? Just throw this one out there. No, it's
I haven't even heard of that one.
It's open source. They make it easy to deploy on AWS EC2, and it consumes Beats metrics, and I think it's also compatible with Logstash. So interesting. But yeah, that there might be some nice feedback in terms of useful knowledge flowing from day job to Edgy or the other way around. In that, that's about it for me.
That'd be awesome. The more we go now with like a more robust deployment, the more interested I am in like pushing custom metrics.
Yeah.
And being able to build charts of like, here's how long diffs are taking. Here's how many diffs we're pushing. Here's how many things are sitting in the analysis queue.
Yeah.
Especially like the more that we have queues.
Right.
So the Graylog is actually something that I like tested whenever I was at University of Oklahoma.
Oh, neat. What do you think of it?
Well, so it was like our example of like a thing we can run ourselves. And the main thing we found, and we had a lot more stuff that we were trying to parse events from. The main thing we found was just that it took so many IOPS on the storage side to keep it happy and fed. Again, we had a lot of stuff versus just, doing log aggregation and then sending it to CloudWatch. That we were like, we're not going to do that. But I don't think that we're going to have that same level of stuff to parse here.
Did you feel like it took more or less IOPS compared to like other ones that you might deploy yourself?
I don't have a clear idea on that because, again, that was kind of the one that we tried just because it was relatively straightforward to stand up at AWS, and that's where we were.
Gotcha.
So take that with a very large pinch of salt.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you're right that like our scale is going to be vastly tinier, and so that won't be as big a deal. But it would be nice to know comparatively whether that's more or less, because like even though we think it's not a big deal now, it would be nice to use the one that's not going to give us heartburn later if and when we expand.
Well, and it sucks to have your health monitoring not work.
Also that.
Well, I'll tell you what, I think we're more or less going to go with this at day job. At least we're going to try it. And I'm going to be running it against more than 100 hosts. So I will let you guys know how that goes. I don't know what scale you were at, Jason, but
we were in the sub 250.
Yeah.
So
okay, yeah, that's where we'll be as well, but above 100. Cool.
Well, we kind of have run out of time. We might want to just punt the other stuff to offline discussion. There was a question money-wise about if some stuff can be shuffled around to pay for that one-off AWS bill. So why don't we punt that to a async discussion so we can move on to our next thing.
Do we know? Are we waiting for Kelsey? Is she coming or?
I thought she was supposed to come. I'll ping her, but she said she wanted to ask something. But if there's anything else that you guys want to talk about first, it's fine. Let me ping her and see if she's gonna come.
Okay.
Oh, I have so many things I want to talk about.
Ah, there we go.
Speak of the devil.
Never mind. I have nothing I want to talk about.
I tried to fill in some of your questions and other things in the PRD, Kelsey. So hopefully that was helpful. I only got like a third of the way through, so sorry.
Thanks. I just got up, so I'll look at it later.
The short of it is, I think you read more into its desired capabilities than there are there. In that there's a lot you had in there about it, like understanding changes or doing diffs, and I don't think, at least in either the short or medium term, we are looking for it to do anything like that. It's hopefully a dumber piece of the pipeline that's just doing snapshots that are more reliable, more consistent, and have much richer, much richer metadata. But it wouldn't necessarily be able to like know what that means about changes over time or anything else. It pushes out data that a higher level system could do that with, like Scanner, or like some researcher comparing site maps that have been published over time or whatever.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you have a clear, is there a drawing somewhere of where what the pipeline looks like and what the tools of the different parts of the pipes are named?
For Scanner?
Well, it seems like the walk would feed into Scanner.
Right. Yes.
So I think she's asking about a diagram for walk, and that does exist, right? There's a whiteboard drawing.
There is that, but then like there's a bigger picture that I'm trying to figure out where they all fit together, and like, does working on Scanner mean that we're also like, to what extent do they have to be done at the same time, or can be done just separately, or?
So the idea there is that largely, except for the fact that like, because the data will be slightly different and the API will be slightly different, it sits in the same place for Scanner that Versionista or Internet Archive have. And so in that sense, it's sort of like just replace either of those in any of the many revisions of many diagrams that we have done, all of which nobody has published a consistent one of, so apologies. I've drawn so many of them, and I'll draw another one if it will be helpful. But yes, for at least the short term and medium term, that's from the Scanner perspective, my vision of it. It's a better version of those underlying tools, but it doesn't necessarily do something fundamentally different for the Scanner pipeline.
Yeah, okay. So walk is the piece of pipeline immediately preceding Scanner and immediately following whatever the output of our data vulnerability assessment is that leads to a list of URLs, right?
Sure, yes.
Thanks.
I think the inputs, the various inputs it might handle come from many places, right? Like the lists that we already use or the sites that we already track in web monitoring, things that we determine from vulnerability assessments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe other nonprofit orgs that want to do government monitoring that like want the data. But yes, you're on the right track there.
Brendan?
Yeah, I think Kelsey, you've just articulated something better than through a question you've asked. You've uncovered a couple of things that are something that this would be a really good use of this time. I think is understanding how, because on the archiving side, we have like sort of multiple things that we're sort of trying to serve with this walk service, and it would help influence the feature map, but also like tightening up the integration points and actually paving a roadmap for our walk being an actual possible replacement for Versionista. I think we're ready to have that conversation based on some of the work that you and I did last week, Rob, unless I'm mistaken.
Sure. I think.
Let's move the ball.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Do you mind if I just? Yeah, so okay. I to take a quick stab at it. Kelsey, hopefully that Yes, yes, we can totally take notes. Nice to see you, Gretchen. Yeah.